Hello everyone, my name is Viren Dayal. I'm a custom broker and a LSC certified trainer in customs law, applied rules and regulations.
For latest updates, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon.
I'll be now discussing the concluding part, that is part 3 of the Customs Act 1962, which starts from chapter 11 to chapter 17. Chapter 11 is from section 77 to section 90. Section 77 to section 84 pertain to special provisions on import and export by baggage, international courier, and through foreign post office. Section 85 to section 90 talks about stores which are normally supplied to a foreign going vessel and aircraft and the related provisions of importation and warehousing the same prior to its supply to a foreign going vessel or aircraft. Chapter 11 talks about coastal goods. Coastal goods means the goods which are not imported but are transported from one coast of India to another coast of India. And these provisions are contained from section 91 to section 98A and what from section 91 to section 98A. This chapter does not talk about import and export goods but only about goods moving from one Indian port to another Indian port, and therefore the concept of consignor and consignee is relating to provisions of coastal goods because the goods are of Indian origin. Chapter 12 pertains to coastal goods and vessel carrying coastal goods. This chapter does not talk about imported goods or exported goods but talks about goods of Indian origin which move from one coast of India to another coast but by a vessel. And therefore, this particular chapter regulates the coasting vessels and the coastal goods when the goods move from one port of India to another port. Since these goods do not talk about imports and exports and they talk about goods of origin, and therefore the provisions of the Indian Contract Act emerges in this particular chapter as far as the buying and selling of goods is concerned, but binds the person, the consignor, with certain rules and regulations which have to be adhered to when the goods are moving in the Indian customs waters and the Indian territorial waters. Chapter 12A was introduced in the Finance Act of 2018. One section, section 99A, and it pertains to audit. The concept of audit underwent a sea change in India when the provision of self-assessment was introduced in the Customs Act in 2011. Since then, from the age-old concept of concurrent audit, the new age audit, that is post-clearance audit, started taking shape. And finally, under Chapter 12A, the provisions of audit are contained and the details of how the audit should be conducted is given in Customs Audit Regulations 2018. This concept is known as premises based audit, and the audit can take place in the premises of the importer and the exporter or anyone who is directly or indirectly concerned with clearing and forwarding of imported goods or export goods. Chapter 12B, verification of identity and compliance, was introduced in the Finance Act of 2019 to enable the custom authorities to verify the antecedents and the proof of premises and other related areas before the commencement of any import or exports in India. So any importer or other any new importer or a new exporter or even a custom broker has to undergo the provision of chapter 99B and the related regulations on verification of identity regulations, which gives power to the custom officers to carry on the KYC procedure and complete the antecedents, mainly relying on the Aadhaar card of the importer or the exporter or the individual. So in the two parts which I have done, part 1 and part 2, I have taken from chapter 1 to chapter 12b. Essentially, chapter 1 to chapter 12b mainly talk about duties, provisions for collection of duties, the processes, the drawback, postal goods. So it mainly talks about import and export of goods into India and the levy of duty. In my opinion, chapter 13, 14, and 16, they talk about the provisions and the powers which are available with custom officers when the goods are liable to confiscation. In other words, if any goods are improperly imported or improperly exported, or they are trying to be smuggled into India or smuggled out of India, the penal provisions of chapter 13, 14, and 16 emerge, and the punishments is meted out to any errant importer or exporter. Or rather, these chapters are suggestive of two main liabilities under the Customs Act. One is the civil liability, which can be imposed on the importer or the exporter by way of penalties, duty, interest, fine, redemption fine, and so on. The other kind of liability which emerges is the criminal liability under chapter 16. And in such cases, besides arrest, the importer exporter will be taken to a sessions judge and a sessions court and can be imprisoned for certain offences under the Customs Act. Whether the person should be given a cognizable and non-cognizable offences, bailable and non-bailable offences are covered under chapter 16. And if the offence is cognizable, then no arrest warrant is required. And if the offence is non-cognizable, arrest warrant is required. So mainly areas concerning to evasion of duty of a certain value and above is covered under the provisions of chapter 16. Chapter 13 gives the right to the proper officer of customs who has reason to believe that I need to search this person either in a customs area or even otherwise for certain goods like gold, silver, ornaments, articles of gold and silver, and so on, can be done under the provision of chapter 13. What are the provisions for seizure of goods? Issue of show cause notice, levy of penalty under improper importation, levy of penalty under improper exportation, redemption fine in lieu of confiscation is covered mainly under chapter 13 and chapter 14. So chapter 13 and 14 can decide the civil liability under the Customs Act 1962. Let me talk about chapter 16 first, which talks about offences and prosecution. When anyone fabricates certain documents or certain goods, misdeclares them, which are first liable to seizure, and then depending upon the degree of offence, the person can be tried in a court of law with imprisonment and with fine, or imprisonment or fine. Interestingly, this chapter, that is offences and prosecution, chapter 16, also talks about offences by custom officers under section 136 and how custom officers can also be tried under the provisions of arrest and penalties and fines. Besides, a custom officer can be arrested that without a reason to believe, not with a reason to believe, but without a reason to believe, tries to search a person or tries to imprison a person, can also be tried under the provision of the Customs Act 1962 and is a punishable offence for that particular customs officer. Another important section in this chapter is section 137, that is compounding offences and cognizance of offences, where the accused can come to terms with the compounding authority and upon payment of compounding amount will not be tried under the criminal offences and basically can start on a clean slate. Of course, there are exceptions in that particular topic, and compounding offences does not cover certain areas where the goods are of SCOMAT, NDPS Act, and so on. And section 140 talks about offences by companies, directors, managers, managing directors, and they can be tried separately or rather individually for any offences under this act. So chapter 13, 14 and 16 talk about the civil liability and the criminal liability, which can accrue simultaneously and can be tried simultaneously under the Customs Act. Chapter 14A is known as Settlement of Cases and was introduced in 1999 on the basis of the Vanchuk Committee report on tax reforms, which suggested that errant taxpayers should not be tried with rigorous provisions of the Customs Act but should be given a mechanism for settlement of cases, and thereby they can seek immunity from prosecution and a lower amount of penalty under the Customs Act when they come out clean and pay all the duty liabilities under the Customs Act which they had not paid hitherto, and upon payment of all the liabilities not declared earlier, including misclassification of goods, they can get immunity from prosecution under the Customs Act and also lower imposition of penalties. Now I will talk about Chapter 15. Chapter 15 talks about appeals and revision. This is more of a judicial procedure where an importer or exporter can seek appellate remedies under the law or under the Customs Act when the importer or the exporter is not satisfied with any order or decision which has been passed by the adjudicating officer under the Customs Act. Who is an adjudicating officer? Any officer of customs who has the power to decide any case on importation, exportation, and pass an order or a decision. For example, loading the value of the goods to take more duty, or passing any other order for imposing penalty and fine, can be tried at various appeals levels, beginning with commissioner appeals. Then it goes to CISTAT, that is the Customs, Excise and Service Tax Appellate Tribunal, and finally the High Court for substantial question of law, and the Supreme Court as the apex court on various matters. The word revision appearing in this particular chapter talks about certain matters which can only go to the revision authority to central government and not to the tribunal. Tribunal or the CISTAT can only try matters pertaining to rate of duty, valuation and tariff. But cases of drawback, goods exported without payment of duty, goods lost in transit, baggage and goods shipped to India as a short shipment can be tried only to the revision authority of the central government and does not go to CISTAT. Therefore, commissioner appeals can take all the matters, and later on the bifurcation is done between CISTAT and the revision authority. This is what is about chapter 15. So I've covered chapter 13, 14, 16, 14a and chapter 15. And the last chapter in the Customs Act, which starts from section 141 to section 161, perhaps the biggest chapter in the Customs Act, has been named as miscellaneous. What is miscellaneous here? Chapter 17 is miscellaneous, and when you read this chapter, when you read section 141 to 161, unlike the other chapters which speak about a specific role under the Customs Act, like drawback, coastal goods, stores, import processes, export processes, warehousing, this chapter miscellaneous has sections which may or may not be used, and they are directly or indirectly interlinked with other chapters. As an example, section 144 talks about drawal of samples. Samples can be both for imports as well as exports. So if, let us presume under section 18 when the sample has to be drawn, then the provision of section 144 will apply for drawal of samples. Similarly, section 142 talks about recovery of sums due to government when the civil liability, that is penalty especially, or duties, interest, is not paid, and the recovery has to be done under section 142. 143 also talks about execution of bonds when the goods need to be cleared with a bond or a surety, and the custom officer allows the goods to be cleared upon taking a particular bond with surety or without surety, and ensuring that the work is complied with as per the terms of the bond, and ensures that the provisions of the bond are complied with by the importer exporter, and upon completion the bond will be cancelled or the bond will be enforced in case the conditions are not complied. Section 145 says that for the purpose of goods in a custom area, for examination or checking or otherwise, all expenses which have to be incurred will be on the importer and exporters. All expenses which have to be incurred have to be borne by the importer exporter, including arranging labor, forklift, crane for examination, and so on. 146A it talks about appointment of authorized representative, and section 147 and 148 talk about the principal agent relationship under the Customs Act. That means between a custom broker and the importer, the exporter, and the liability in case there's a short levy of goods. 148 applies mainly to shipping companies and airlines who are authorized agents of these shipping companies and airline agents whose only work is to clear the arrival and the departure of a conveyance at a customs station. 149, an amendment of documents, has been an old section. And what are the provisions for amendment when it comes to either amendment of a manifest or an import report, or amendment post clearance of an import and export consignment from Indian customs. Section 150 talks about disposal of goods or auctioning of the goods in case they are not cleared upon their arrival in India, or where the title has been relinquished under section 23 subsection 2. Section 151 talks about certain officers of the state government, central government, etc., to help custom officers to carry on their duties. And 151A talks about instructions to various custom officers by way of circulars, standing orders, public notices, and they are mainly binding on various field formations of Indian customs, but they need not necessarily be followed by a court or the importer and the exporter, that can be challenged. Importantly, section 151A talks about the board cannot give any instructions to force a proper officer of customs and adjudicating officer of customs to make an assessment in a particular manner, nor can it tell the commissioner of customs appeals to carry on or discharge his duties in a particular manner. 151B talks about the reciprocal arrangement which India has with other countries and they exchange information, especially for enforcement of provisions pertaining to evasion of duty or improper import and export of goods. Section 152 talks about delegation of powers to various officers of customs. The limit, or rather the monetary limit of adjudication under the Customs Act is defined under section 152. 153 is mode of dispatch of a particular order, decision, summons under the Customs Act, and which are the different modes prescribed which can help a custom officer to ensure that the communication is effectively and correctly delivered to whom it should be delivered, and this is modes of service. Section 154 talks about correction of clerical errors by the central government, the board, the officer of customs, which can be done anytime. And 154A talks about rounding off of the duty to the nearest rupee. Section 155 talks about protection of action taken under the Act. Here, the custom officer is deemed to be doing work in good faith or as a and cannot be tried in a court of law, or no suit can be initiated against the custom officer or on the central government unless and until a notice issued at least a month prior of filing a suit or a case. Similarly, no action will have legal force if any suit or action or any case is filed after 3 months of the occurrence of the event. So basically this section talks about the custom officer is doing work in good faith, a bona fide act, even if it is done negligently, unless it is proved otherwise. This is the provision of section 155. Protection given to officers of customs. Section 156, section 157 is the delegated legislation which talks about that the central government will make rules under section 156 and the board will make regulations under section 157. The rules are made by the central government because it has an element of tax or duty in it, whereas section 157 talks about regulations which can be made by the board because mainly they are procedural in nature. Section 158, 159 talk about that every legislation will have a prospective effect and not retrospective. Sections or certain ordinances must be placed before the parliament and should be ratified by the parliament when it starts a particular session in the parliament, namely the monsoon session, the budget session, or the winter session, and so on. Section 160 and Section 161 are repeals and savings, that when the Custom Act began in 1962, from the 1st of February 1963, what are the acts which are repealed, and the saving clause, that what acts will continue which were there earlier in force along with the Customs Act 1962. Section 161 talks about removal of difficulties, where the government can issue a special or a general order to remove difficulties while implementing the Customs Act 1962. This was the end of chapter 17 and part 3 of this particular topic.
For detailed learning of all logistics subjects, visit www.logiveda.com.